CEO Andy England was hit with an existential crisis.
Well, it was not good, that's for sure.
He runs the Minnesota-based Phillips Distilling Company, the maker of Sour Puss.
Vast majority, about 98%, is sold in Canada. And so, in many ways, we think of it as being a Canadian brand. And so all the more reason we should produce it in Canada. We've moved to Canada and are proud of it.
It's a small but symbolically important victory.
Canada just scored one of the most unexpected symbolic victories of the entire Canada-US trade war. And it came from a bright red bottle sitting in a nightclub bar. Sour Puss, the hard-to-forget sweet and sour drink that generations of Canadians have taken shots with, has officially abandoned the United States and moved its production across the border to Montreal. In a year dominated by Trump's tariffs, trade threats, and nationalist pressure campaigns, it turns out a simple party drink has delivered one of the clearest messages yet. When Washington pushes, Canada pushes back, and sometimes the U.S. even loses business to us.
The story starts with a brand that most Canadians know by taste alone. Sour Puss was everywhere in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the kind of drink that lived behind the bar of every student pub and dive lounge. But what many Canadians didn't realize is that almost all of it was made in Minnesota by Phillips Distilling Company, a quiet American manufacturer that had grown deeply dependent on its northern market. CEO Andy England told CBC they sold around $23 million worth of Sour Puss in Canada last year, and that an astonishing 98% of all sales worldwide come from Canadian customers. In the United States, the product barely exists. Then Trump's second-term trade war kicked into gear. As he slapped broad tariffs on Canadian goods, tariffs on steel, tariffs on aluminum, tariffs on autos, several Canadian provinces quietly retaliated. They didn't need to pass new laws or create big headlines. They simply stopped buying American-made liquor. Shelves that once stocked U.S. spirits went empty. Orders slowed to a crawl. Entire categories disappeared almost overnight. For Phillips Distilling, it was an existential threat. If Canada wasn't buying, the company wasn't selling. Their entire business model was about to collapse under the weight of a political fight they had nothing to do with. So after months of emergency planning, they made a decision that says more about the current North American trade climate than any speech or press release could. They shifted Sour Puss production from Minnesota into a factory in Montreal under a new 5-year contract. England didn't sugarcoat the message. He admitted openly that provinces, quote, clearly want to buy liquor made in Canada, and that the company understood and accepted the reality. What started as a provincial protest suddenly became a cross-border production shift. A tiny victory on paper, but one that trade experts described as, quote, symbolically important for Quebec and for Canada as a whole.
The remarkable thing about this story is not the brand, the products, or even the size of the deal. It's the way everyday Canadian consumers, along with provincial liquor boards, managed to flip the logic of Trump's trade war upside down. This wasn't a fight launched by Ottawa. It wasn't a retaliatory tariff crafted by lawyers. It was simply a collective decision that if the United States was willing to weaponize trade, then Canadians could weaponize purchasing power. And it worked. The broader political backdrop makes this moment even more meaningful. Trump, now deep into his second term, has spent the year escalating tariffs across the world. China, Mexico, Canada, Europe, nobody has been spared. He has tried to force companies and countries to reorient supply chains toward American factories. But the unintended consequence has become increasingly visible. Many American producers are discovering that being made in the USA no longer guarantees access to the Canadian market. As the tariffs stack up, Canadian buyers, from the largest retailers to everyday shoppers, are choosing domestic alternatives. And when that happens at scale, companies like Phillips Distilling face a simple calculation. They can stay in the United States and lose the Canadian consumer entirely, or move part of their operations north and keep their survival intact. This is not an isolated case. Reuters, Bloomberg, and AP have all reported this year that Canadian cross-border shopping is dropping sharply. Flights, weekend trips, gas purchases, grocery runs, all have softened dramatically. Canadians are making a quiet but powerful statement. In an era where the U.S. president treats trade like a blunt weapon, Canadians are treating their dollar like a shield. It is economic self-respect, and it is starting to change corporate behavior. The timing adds another layer. Canada is entering a new phase of economic independence under Prime Minister Mark Carney, who has spent the year pushing for a more diversified trade portfolio. His government is investing heavily in clean energy, critical minerals, and coast-to-coast infrastructure. It is building new links with South Korea, ASEAN, and India. It is recalibrating ties with China after the surprising APEC turning point meeting between Xi Jinping and Carney. And it is preparing for a combative USMCA review in 2026, where Canada is expected to take a firmer stance than ever before. Against that backdrop, an American company moving production to Montreal, even a small one, sends a signal that echoes far beyond the beverage aisle. It suggests that Trump's tariffs, far from strengthening U.S. leverage, are accelerating a North American realignment that benefits Canada in subtle but real ways. If even an inexpensive, low-margin liquor brand can't afford to stay American-made, what happens when the same pressure hits sectors like auto parts, food processing, or household goods? The truth is that Canada's influence in the trade war has never been military, and it has never been about threats. It has been about market gravity. Canada is a massive, stable, high-income economy with an 85% clean power grid, critical mineral resources, and a consumer base that still has trust in domestic institutions. Companies need access to that market, and if earning that access means moving to Canada, many of them will. Sour Puss is simply the early signal. For the United States, especially the Trump White House, the optics here are uncomfortable. A policy designed to force production into America has instead pushed production out. A tariff meant to defend American industry has ended up eroding part of it, and a trade war intended to discipline Canada has instead revealed just how much leverage Canada actually has, not because of Ottawa's politics, but because of the choices of Canadians themselves.
In the grand scheme of global trade, one liquor brand moving factories won't alter the entire power balance. But symbolically, this moment matters. It shows that Canada isn't the quiet neighbor anymore. It shows that when pushed, Canadians can reshape markets simply by changing what they buy and what they refuse to buy. And it shows that Trump's trade war, far from putting Canada on the defensive, is increasingly pushing companies and supply chains toward Canadian soil. The question now is what happens next. If Sour Puss is the first brand to flee the U.S. for Canada, who will be the second? And what does it say about Trump's trade war when even American companies decide the safer future is north of the border? That's a story we'll be watching closely.
Canada now really looking to China as America seems like an unfriendly trading partner at this point.
Donald Trump shutting down talks on trade with Canada. He's driving so much of the Western world into the arms of China, because if he's going to deny us access to the U.S. market, well, we got to go where there are buyers, and China is the largest physical market in the world.
Trump wanted to punish Canada, but ended up pushing the whole Western world toward China. In the fall of 2025, what started as a personal clash between Donald Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has quietly become one of the biggest geopolitical shifts of the decade. By shutting down trade talks with Canada and imposing sweeping tariffs across allied economies, Trump has done something few American presidents ever managed. He has driven his closest partners to look east. Canada's new outreach to Asia, Europe's revived trade with Beijing, and Japan's quiet expansion of mineral deals with China all trace back to one man's belief that punishment creates strength. But what Trump didn't see is that isolation creates a vacuum, and China is moving to fill it. The moment of rupture came in early October. Trump halted all trade discussions with Canada after a television ad from Ontario mocked his tariff policies. Ottawa didn't react with outrage. It pivoted. Within days, Carney's team was in Asia, setting up talks that would include a private meeting with President Xi Jinping. For Canada, this wasn't a sudden shift. The U.S. now treats even its neighbors as competitors, with tariffs on autos, metals, and lumber driving up costs and straining jobs on both sides of the border. Faced with that reality, Carney chose a different path, to expand Canada's export network beyond North America. At home, political commentators like Scott Reed called it from the frying pan into the fire. Canada was leaving one difficult partner for another. But the decision was about survival, not ideology. When the largest economy in the world shuts its door, a middle power like Canada must find another one open. Canada is not alone in this realignment. Across Europe and Asia, governments once firmly anchored to Washington are testing new trade routes. After Trump's 25 to 35% import tariffs took effect in mid-2025, European leaders began reopening dialogues with Beijing to stabilize industrial supply chains. Japan quietly expanded its export of battery minerals to China through new port deals in Yokohama and Dalian. South Korea's businesses, long dependent on the American consumer market, signed fresh contracts with Chinese electric component buyers worth billions. Each of these countries had signed separate trade frameworks with Washington earlier in 2025, the EU in August, Japan in September, and South Korea in October, but none trusted them as lasting. Trump's willingness to cancel or suspend talks without notice left allies wondering who might be next. For them, engagement with China was not enthusiasm, it was insurance. Trump's America First doctrine was built on the idea that pressure produces compliance. Using tariffs as his main instrument, he demanded that partners move production to the United States and accept American-defined terms of access. It worked in the short run. Some factories returned, job numbers in select states improved, and the White House celebrated every new headline about reshoring. But diplomacy doesn't run on fear for long. When the president cut off negotiations with Ottawa after an ad on Canadian television, it sent a global signal that economic partnership with Washington could turn personal overnight. For decades, American strength depended on predictable alliances: NATO for defense, USMCA for trade, G7 for coordination. By replacing reliability with volatility, Trump transformed allies into self-protective actors. They still value U.S. markets, but no longer trust U.S. policy. China has been quick to seize the opening. Its Ministry of Commerce reported in late September that trade with Western economies rose 12% year over year, even as tensions with Washington deepened. Canada's own export data show rising interest in agricultural and energy shipments to Asia, particularly through Pacific ports in British Columbia. For Beijing, it's an easy calculation. The more unpredictable Trump becomes, the more foreign capital and attention drift toward China's stability. For Western capitals, the calculation is much harder. Doing business with China means lower costs and larger markets, but also dependence on a rival that controls rare earth exports and monitors foreign investment. The G7 nations don't trust China, but they also can't live without its market. That uneasy balance defines the new global economy, engagement driven not by faith, but by survival. This is the dilemma Carney now faces. Moving toward China offers economic relief, but political risk. Canada still remembers the 2018 detention of the two Michaels and Beijing's retaliatory tariffs on canola. Yet in a world where the U.S. is no longer a predictable buyer, the alternative is shrinking growth. Throughout the confrontation, Carney has chosen composure over confrontation. When Trump exploded over the Ontario ad, Canada didn't respond with counter-tariffs or speeches. Instead, the government focused on new partnerships, a $300 billion export expansion plan with Asia, and upcoming trade talks with the Philippines under the ASEAN framework. This strategy reflects a shift in tone. Canada no longer defines its economic policy by how Washington reacts. It defines it by where Canadian companies can grow. Observers in Ottawa see Carney's diplomacy as patient, almost technocratic. While Trump governs by impulse, Carney governs by balance. By refusing to escalate, he has positioned Canada as the adult in the room, the partner willing to work with anyone who respects the rules of trade, even if that means sitting across from Beijing. The ripple effects of Trump's tariffs are now visible across the global economy. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the World Trade Organization have both warned that prolonged tariffs risk raising consumer prices and destabilizing supply chains. By October 2025, U.S. inflation was hovering near 5%, with energy and vehicle costs among the biggest drivers. Meanwhile, China's share of global trade in manufactured goods reached a record 31%, according to IMF data, its highest since 2020. Europe and Asia are quietly rebuilding connections that bypass American oversight. The West is not abandoning the U.S., but it is diversifying away from it. In practice, that means more Chinese financing for infrastructure in Europe, more Canadian grain shipped to Asian ports, and more Asian investors buying stakes in Western resource projects. What Trump saw as punishment for disobedience has become the fuel for a new economic alignment, one where China, not America, sits at the center.
Trump wanted to punish Canada, but ended up pushing the whole Western world toward China. By using tariffs as weapons and temper as strategy, he has fractured the alliances that once gave America its leverage. Canada's pivot to Asia is not betrayal, it is adaptation. Europe's outreach to Beijing is not admiration, it is necessity. And as each country looks for stability beyond Washington, the balance of power tilts further toward the east. History shows that when America isolates its friends, it strengthens its rivals. What we're witnessing in 2025 is not just a trade dispute, it's a redrawing of global trust. If this continues, the century that began as America's could quietly end as China's.
We know we can't control what other nations do. So we're focused on what we can control, building our strength right here at home.
The Port of Montreal's plans to expand is one of the 5 major projects Prime Minister Mark Carney has targeted to fast-track. At the end of its construction, it will handle more than 1 million containers a year.
President Trump continues to celebrate tariffs as proof of America's strength, presenting them as a tool to force partners into line. But across the border, Canada is taking a quieter approach. Instead of chasing headlines, Ottawa is laying bricks for long-term resilience. It is investing in projects that do not show instant results, but will change the country's position in global trade for decades to come. At the center of this effort stands the Port of Montreal expansion at Contrecoeur. Prime Minister Mark Carney has placed it among the 5 national projects chosen for fast-track approval. For Ottawa, this expansion is not simply about handling more cargo. It is about securing independence in logistics at a time when tariffs and trade disputes make cross-border reliance riskier than ever.
The Port of Montreal is already close to its full capacity. According to the Montreal Port Authority, the existing terminals are nearly saturated. Without expansion, container traffic risks hitting a bottleneck that could choke one of Canada's most important gateways. The Contrecoeur project is designed to prevent that. Once complete, it will add capacity for more than 1 million containers per year. The federal government has created a major projects office to coordinate the work and ensure deadlines do not slip. Under Bill C-5, Ottawa can also streamline the regulatory process so that major projects move faster. The benefits are not minor. The federal government estimates the expansion will generate 1,200 construction jobs and bring 140 million Canadian dollars in annual economic value once operational. But challenges remain. Fisheries and Oceans Canada and Environment Canada must still approve measures to protect the copper red horsefish and the western chorus frog. Environmental groups have also launched lawsuits against Bill C-5 in Quebec's Superior Court. Despite these hurdles, officials remain confident. The project will move forward, with fieldwork scheduled for 2027 and completion targeted for 2030. The strategic meaning of this expansion goes far beyond container counts. For years, much of central Canada's trade has flowed through American ports like New York and New Jersey before reaching global markets. This dependency gave the United States leverage, especially when tariffs became a political weapon.
With a new terminal at Montreal, Canadian exporters will be able to ship directly to Europe and the Atlantic markets without rerouting through U.S. infrastructure. This shift is crucial in the context of Trump's reciprocal tariffs. Instead of being trapped, Canada is creating alternatives. The expansion aligns with broader investments, such as Electra Battery Materials' cobalt refinery in Ontario and new development in potash mining. Together, these moves build a foundation for supply chains that are less exposed to sudden tariff shocks from Washington. In the long run, projects like this could also encourage global shippers to see Canada as a stable hub, not just a secondary option. By proving it can deliver capacity and reliability, Canada strengthens its bargaining power in future trade negotiations. That credibility matters when neighbors and allies are rethinking their supply routes under constant tariff uncertainty. Trump's strategy is built on short-term pressure. His administration points to tariffs as evidence that America is winning the trade fight. But the Canadian response tells another story. By investing in its own capacity, Canada is preparing for the long game. The Port of Montreal expansion has become a symbol of this approach. It ensures that the nation can handle more trade on its own soil, reducing reliance on U.S. ports and limiting exposure to American tariff politics. In the end, tariffs that were meant to weaken Canada are fueling its determination to stand on firmer ground. When the terminal opens in 2030, it will not just represent steel and concrete. It will represent a strategic shift. The map of North American trade will look different, with Canada more confident as a direct gateway to the world. Trump's tariffs may have caused pain in the short term, but they are also pushing Canada to build independence that could outlast any administration in Washington.